Dakota was 34 years old when her life, until then monotonous and predictable, began to crumble irreversibly. A literature teacher at a private school, the mother of an 8-year-old boy, and the wife of a man who had learned to live silently in the face of domestic tensions. It wasn't a marriage marked by major arguments, but by the lukewarm indifference and invisible influence of a mother-in-law who had turned veiled criticism into her favorite sport. Her comments, disguised as concern, always found a way to leave small cracks in Dakota's self-esteem. And he, her husband, remained impassive, as if his mother's words were background noise he had no business turning off. That drab routine seemed eternal, until one random Sunday, in the middle of a family lunch, an unexpected sign set off all the alarm bells. The table was set with the usual care. The aroma of the roast filled the air. Wine glasses sparkled in the midday light, and conversations revolved around trivial matters. Dakota, sitting opposite her mother-in-law, was absent-mindedly turning the edge of her napkin between her fingers when she noticed her phone vibrate. Upon unlocking it, she found a message from an unknown number. "Don't react. You're being recorded." A wave of cold ran through her body, while her face remained impassive. She looked up and saw her husband pouring more wine, her mother-in-law carving the meat with surgical precision, and the others smiling as if nothing had happened. But something in their gazes seemed studied, calculated. The echo of that phrase, as improbable as it was disturbing, began to settle in her mind. "You're being recorded." Dakota maintained her composure, even though every muscle in her body begged her to get up and leave. Her teacher's instinct, trained to remain calm even in a chaotic classroom, allowed her to dissemble. However, her senses began to sharpen. She noticed how her mother-in-law insisted on asking seemingly harmless questions that struck a nerve. Her performance at work, her schedule, her patience with the child. Questions that could provoke sharp responses if she weren't in control. She also noticed that one of her cousin's cell phones, strategically placed on a vase in the background, was pointed right at her chair. Every detail fit with the warning. They wanted to provoke her and record it. Returning home that afternoon, while her son played in his room, Dakota mentally replayed every gesture from lunch. The idea of being recorded wasn't just unsettling, it was deeply humiliating. She sat down at her desk and opened her computer, trying to distract herself. But a new discomfort prompted her to search every corner of her own house. It was then, as she moved a stack of books near the shelf, that she saw a metallic glint between the spines. It wasn't dust, or just any reflection. It was a tiny lens, hidden and connected to a micro cable that disappeared behind the furniture. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't paranoia. The surveillance was real, and it was happening inside her own home. The discovery led her to a sleepless night, searching every room with her pulse racing. She found 2 more devices, one hidden in the living room lamp and another camouflaged in a picture frame in the hallway. Each discovery confirmed that this was not an improvised act, but a precisely planned installation. At dawn, having barely slept, Dakota decided to inspect her husband's computer. The folder was buried in a hidden directory, protected by a password that, to her surprise, was her mother-in-law's name. Inside, dozens of videos showed Dakota in intimate, everyday moments, making coffee in her pajamas, talking on the phone, crying in front of the mirror. But the most disturbing thing was seeing how some fragments had been edited, slowed down, or cut to suggest violent reactions or unstable moods. With her stomach in knots and her hands shaking, Dakota understood the scope of the plan: to fabricate a distorted version of herself to justify any action against her. The idea that they wanted to use these images to influence custody of her son ignited a fury she had until then kept buried. She couldn't afford an impulsive outburst. She knew every move had to be calculated. She saved encrypted copies of all the footage on an external drive and hid it in a location only she knew. Then she turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and sat down to devise a plan. The first step would be to find someone capable of legally challenging a scheme that she sensed went far beyond a simple family dispute. The next morning, Dakota discreetly searched forums and private groups for recommendations of attorneys specializing in stalking and unlawful surveillance. That's how she came across the name of Laura Benitez, a lawyer with a reputation for handling complex emotional abuse cases. She made an emergency appointment, and within 48 hours, she was sitting in a small office filled with precisely labeled filing cabinets. Laura listened without interrupting, taking quick notes and nodding at key moments. When Dakota finished, the attorney was blunt. This was not only a crime, but a pattern of calculated harassment. She suggested immediate action to prevent the recordings from being used in a rigged court case. That same day, she filed a request for injunctions to suspend the mother-in-law's contact with the child and authorize the installation of a counter-surveillance system at Dakota's home. The installation was almost surgical. A technical team, recommended by Laura, installed devices that not only detected hidden cameras and microphones, but also recorded any remote connection attempts to the home's devices. In less than a week, evidence began to accumulate. Repeated attempts to access the home network from an address linked to the husband's computer, and most revealingly, an audio recording at the mother-in-law's house in which precise instructions were given to provoke Dakota and capture her reactions. This evidence left no room for doubt. The plan had been in the making for months, with a detailed script and well-defined actors. The certainty that everything had been premeditated ignited in Dakota a mixture of rage and determination. It wasn't just about defending herself, but about regaining control of her own narrative. With Laura, she devised a strategy that included a calculated coup, a fake birthday party for her mother-in-law, organized with the complicity of a distant cousin who was unaware of the full plan. The event would be held in a rented hall, under the guise of an intimate celebration. There, amidst drinks and forced toasts, Dakota activated a portable projector and without warning began playing the original recordings, uncut and untampered with. The conversations and gestures of her mother-in-law, her husband, and other accomplices were exposed for all to see. The silence that took over the room was dense, interrupted only by the sound of bated breaths and the occasional incredulous murmur. The impact was immediate. Some family members left the room in shame, others froze, unable to process what they were seeing. Dakota's husband tried to approach the projector, but one of the security technicians she'd hired blocked his way. When the screening ended, Dakota didn't say a word. Her silence spoke volumes. That night, calls and messages of support multiplied, but veiled warnings and anonymous threats also arrived. The blow had been a surefire hit, but the counterattack would soon follow. Deep down, she knew this was only the first round in a longer and more dangerous war. The following weeks were a strange mix of relief and constant tension. Dakota had managed to crack the facade of perfection projected by her mother-in-law and husband, but the signs of harassment continued unabated. Strange cars would appear parked in front of her house for hours, and texts with no sender would arrive on her phone with phrases like, "You're not finished," or "We'll always know where you are." One night, returning from teaching, she found the back door slightly forced open. Nothing was missing, but the simple fact that someone had entered was a disturbing reminder that she was still under surveillance. Laura insisted on documenting everything, and every incident was reported to the police, though official responses were slow and inconclusive. The most disturbing twist came when a bank notice alerted her to unusual activity related to her home's mortgage. According to the records, a woman named Megan Lang was listed as the buyer, with the deal practically finalized. Dakota hadn't met any Megan Lang, but the last name sounded vague, like an echo of something she'd heard years before. Upon further investigation, she discovered that Megan had been in a relationship with her husband before they were married and coincidentally was working on real estate projects linked to one of the partners at the firm where he practiced law. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had orchestrated a scheme to dispossess her of her home, using Megan as a key player. With Laura's help, Dakota began piecing together the fragments of information she had. She discovered that Megan, her mother-in-law, and her husband's business partner were part of a tightly structured network that not only manipulated and harassed women but was also involved in real estate fraud and legal cover-ups. There were testimonies from other victims, stories almost identical to her own: hidden cameras, malicious editing, attempts to emotionally destabilize and isolate people until they were stripped of their assets. That confirmation gave Dakota a renewed sense of purpose. It was no longer just about protecting herself and her son, but about uncovering a scheme that had destroyed lives. The plan for the ultimate counterattack was silently hatched. Laura managed to secure an official invitation from the company where her husband worked for Dakota. A gala corporate event, attended by clients, partners, and the press. It would be the perfect setting. On the night of the event, Dakota appeared impeccably dressed, carrying a briefcase containing evidence organized into physical and digital folders. She waited for just the right moment when her husband's partner was on the podium giving a speech about integrity and professional commitment. Then she asked to speak. In front of dozens of people, she projected documents, screenshots, and recordings demonstrating the manipulation, the real estate fraud, and the connections between the three. The murmur in the room grew to deafening levels, and the expressions of those involved went from shock to panic in a matter of seconds. The consequences were immediate. Before the night was over, several event attendees were already making calls to media and law enforcement contacts. In less than 48 hours, Dakota's husband was removed from his position. The business partner was suspended while an official investigation was launched, and the fraudulent operation to sell the house was quashed. A judge provisionally granted full custody of the child to Dakota, citing evidence of manipulation and harassment as determining factors. For the first time in months, she felt the board beginning to tilt in her favor, although she knew the opposing pieces could still move. However, the feeling of victory was marred by new signs of danger. A dark car began, appearing frequently near her street, and an unannounced package arrived in her mailbox with a note that read, "This isn't over." Dakota reinforced the locks and kept the surveillance cameras active, but nothing prepared her for what she found one night while cleaning her bedroom. A tiny, perfectly camouflaged micro camera inside the ottoman of her nightstand. The device, upon analysis, revealed it was transmitting directly to an address linked to Megan. That discovery was the trigger for the police to take decisive action. In a coordinated raid, authorities arrested Megan, her husband's partner, and, to Dakota's surprise, her ex-husband as a direct accomplice. The evidence seized included not only Dakota's surveillance footage, but also records of other similar operations carried out against different women in recent years. The case became a national scandal, with headlines describing the network of manipulation and fraud that operated under the guise of respectability. While seeing them handcuffed and escorted by police didn't erase all the damage they'd suffered, for Dakota, it was a moment of vindication. She had managed not only to survive, but to bring down an entire structure that had tried to destroy her. Months later, with the legal process underway and reinforced protective measures in place, Dakota decided to move to a small coastal town with her son. There, away from the media noise and the streets that reminded her of every step of that nightmare, she began to rebuild her life. She focused on her work as a teacher, resumed personal projects she had abandoned, and for the first time in a long time, slept with the windows open without feeling like someone was watching her. She knew that surveillance and mistrust were difficult wounds to heal, but she also understood that her greatest victory hadn't been winning in court, but ensuring that no one would silence her again. In that certainty, she found peace. In the days following the arrests, Dakota experienced an emotional roller coaster she hadn't anticipated. On one hand, she felt the satisfaction of seeing those who had persecuted her facing serious charges. On the other, the media exposure forced her to relive every detail in interviews with prosecutors, journalists, and even acquaintances who appeared after years of silence. Calls from unknown numbers multiplied. Some were from reporters seeking statements, others from women claiming to have been through similar situations. Each voice she heard with fear and desperation reminded her why she had decided not to stop until she reached the end. but it also imposed a new burden on her. Now, more than a victim, she was seen as an example, and that role wasn't always easy to sustain. Court hearings became fraught with tension. Megan avoided her gaze. Her associate observed her with calculated coldness, and her ex-husband, visibly weakened, seemed torn between resentment and regret. Dakota attended with Laura and a court-appointed escort, aware that her presence wasn't just a legal act, but a declaration that she wasn't about to disappear. Each time new evidence was presented, emails with instructions for manipulating videos, bank transfers related to the fraudulent purchases, the silence in the courtroom became almost physical, as if everyone was holding their breath. Still, Dakota knew that a formal conviction could take months, and that her safety remained an unwavering priority. During that time, Dakota's house became a makeshift fortress. The counter-surveillance team regularly checked every corner, and the windows remained covered with thick curtains that blocked out any view from outside. It wasn't a lockdown out of irrational fear, but a necessary precaution after discovering that, even with those responsible in custody, invisible hands remained ready to continue the dirty work. Some nights, while grading exams at the dining room table, she heard noises outside, hurried footsteps, engines that started when they saw her appear. She learned not to underestimate such details. In her experience, every strange gesture could be a warning. The work environment wasn't free of tension either. Although the school administration offered support, some colleagues began to treat her with an uncomfortable mix of compassion and morbid curiosity. In the staff room, conversations sometimes stopped when she entered, as if her presence was a reminder that anyone could be the subject of a front-page story. Still, Dakota clung to her job like an anchor. She prepared more creative lessons, incorporated discussions about ethics, privacy, and media manipulation, and found that the students, far from seeing her as a sensational case, listened with genuine attention. It was as if, without intending to, she had turned her experience into a living lesson about the importance of not giving in to injustice. Sessions with her therapist became an essential refuge. There, Dakota could release the rigidity she maintained in public and speak unfiltered about her accumulated fatigue, her dreams interrupted by hidden camera images, and that constant feeling of being evaluated even when she was alone. The therapist helped her identify surveillance patterns that had become embedded in her mind, such as always looking twice before entering a room or memorizing license plates she saw repeatedly. This wasn't wanton paranoia. It was a learned response to months of calculated harassment. Meanwhile, Laura continued to build an increasingly solid case. She located 2 former employees of the partner's company who agreed to testify under oath. Their testimony confirmed that not only was there a scheme of emotional manipulation and fraud, but that there were internal protocols to fabricate evidence against women who were inconvenient to their interests. This revelation changed the tone of the trial. It was no longer just Dakota's case, but a network with tentacles longer than they had imagined. The prosecution, which until then had moved cautiously, began to push to expedite the hearings and request harsher sentences. Media pressure increased when an investigative program aired a detailed report on the case. Images of the hearings, excerpts from the evidence, and interviews with cybersecurity experts filled the screen, exposing the network's modus operandi. Dakota did not participate in the recording, but her silhouette appeared in some archive footage, walking toward the courtroom with a firm stride. This exposure brought with it a wave of messages of support from strangers, but also an increase in hostile comments on social media, where some tried to discredit her with absurd theories. She learned to ignore them, reminding herself that external noise should not detract from her main objective. At the same time, her relationship with her son grew closer than ever. At just 8 years old, he had witnessed far too much for his age, but he displayed surprising maturity. They shared simple routines, making breakfast together, reading before bed, going for walks in a nearby park. Dakota made an effort to keep him in the darker details, even though she knew he understood more than he let on. Sometimes silently, the boy would take her hand and squeeze it tightly, as if to remind her that, despite everything, they were still an unbeatable team. That bond, more than any legal victory, was what gave Dakota the energy to continue. One afternoon, while reviewing documents with Laura in the office, an unexpected notice arrived. One of the counter-surveillance devices installed in their home had detected an intermittent transmission signal. The technician in charge explained that it wasn't an old device, but something recently installed. That information set off alarm bells. Dakota and Laura decided to go in person, accompanied by a trusted expert. They scanned each room with the frequency detector until, in a hallway window frame, they found a BART microtransmitter the size of a coin, camouflaged under a layer of paint. The discovery confirmed that, even with the main suspects behind bars, there were still hands ready to continue spying. That night, Dakota slept with the light on, not out of irrational fear, but because she needed to clearly see any shadow or movement. She felt the harassment had a psychological component that sought to wear her down little by little, like a constant drip on a stone. The next day, she presented the new device's evidence to the judge, requesting expanded protective measures. The response was immediate. Intermittent police surveillance was assigned to her street, and the installation of an alarm system directly connected to the police station was authorized. Although it didn't eliminate the risk, it gave her a modicum of peace of mind to move forward. With the increased security, Dakota began allowing herself small outings she'd previously avoided. She revisited the neighborhood library where the manager greeted her with a warm hug and a "We missed you." Returning to that space, with its smell of aged paper and the friendly silence between the shelves, was like reclaiming a piece of her former life. She also reconnected with a university friend who invited her to participate in talks on digital harassment and privacy rights. At first, she hesitated. She feared that exposing herself again might attract unwanted attention. But then she realized that speaking about her experience with caution and facts could be a way to transform fear into a tool. At one of those talks, a woman in the audience approached her with tears in her eyes to thank her for sharing her story. She confessed that she had experienced something similar and had never dared to speak out. That moment reminded Dakota why it was worth continuing to speak out, not just for her, but for all those who had been silenced. Little by little, those interactions began to build a real support network, distinct from the ephemeral one of social media. They were connections of people meeting face to face, sharing stories without judgment or headlines, and they gave Dakota the feeling that she was not alone in the struggle. That impulse led her to accept an invitation to participate in a panel alongside cybersecurity and criminal law specialists. The event was held in a university auditorium packed with students and professionals. Dakota spoke with a firm voice, recounting not only the events but also the emotional impact of feeling watched in the most intimate spaces. She explained how harassment doesn't always present itself with visible blows, but can infiltrate routines, eroding trust in every gesture and every person. Her intervention was met with prolonged applause, and several attendees approached her afterward to ask for guidance or simply to thank her for bringing such a silent problem to light. However, that exposure also came at a cost. A few days later, Dakota received an envelope with no return address at her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the phrase, "The stage doesn't always protect you," written in letters cut from magazines. The police took it as a direct threat, but were unable to trace its source. The incident reminded her that even though the main network had been dismantled, there were still people willing to intimidate her. Still, rather than locking herself away, Dakota strengthened her resolve. She understood that giving in to fear would be conceding them the victory they had failed to achieve in court. It was in the midst of this tension that Dakota began to seriously consider leaving the city. It wasn't an impulsive decision, but rather a calm assessment of her priorities: her son's safety, her own emotional stability, and the possibility of starting over in an environment less contaminated by memories and threats. She made several discreet visits to small towns, looking for a place that combined tranquility with good school services. One of those trips, she found a modest but bright house near the coast. with a backyard where she imagined her son playing without fear. That image remained engraved in her mind as an achievable dream. Before finalizing the move, Dakota closed several pending chapters. With Laura's help, she signed an agreement to secure full ownership of her current home until she could sell it on her own terms, preventing any attempts at fraud. She also left clear instructions for her case to remain active, with the prosecutor's office ensuring that any violations of court orders would be addressed swiftly. Every step she took was designed to protect the future, not only for her, but also for the child. When she finally set the move date, she felt a mixture of relief and melancholy. She was leaving behind a battlefield, but also the tangible evidence of everything she had survived. Moving day dawned with a clear sky, as if the weather had agreed to mark a new beginning. A couple of trusted friends helped her load the boxes into a small truck, while her son, excited, checked every empty corner of the house one last time. As Dakota walked through the rooms, she couldn't help but remember where she'd found the cameras, the sleepless nights, and the silent arguments that had filled those walls. She closed the front door with a strange calm, aware that it wasn't just about physically leaving, but about diffusing a scenario that had been manipulated to break her. Arriving at their new home was, like entering another reality. The distant sound of waves replaced the constant traffic, and the salty air seemed to wash away the accumulated weight on their shoulders. The boy ran into the garden laughing as Dakota unloaded the first boxes into the living room. That afternoon, he sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun set over the sea, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. He knew there were still court matters to be resolved, but at that moment, all that mattered was that rare and precious sense of peace. In the following months, Dakota adapted surprisingly quickly to life in the coastal city. She discovered a small bookstore downtown where she soon became a regular. The owner, an older man with a prodigious memory for classic authors, always had a recommendation ready for her. She also began teaching reading workshops for teenagers at the municipal library, gradually integrating herself into the community. The change of environment allowed her to recover simple routines that had become impossible in her previous city, going for walks at dusk, leaving the windows open, listening to music without fear of someone recording her. That normalcy, so basic and so necessary, became her greatest treasure. However, Dakota never completely let her guard down. She maintained a discreet security system at home and, from time to time, checked the surveillance cameras as a kind of preventative ritual. She didn't do it out of fear, but as a reminder that she had learned to take care of herself. Letters from women who had followed her case continued to arrive, some with short stories, others with tales as painful as her own. Dakota responded to them all, aware that her voice, now more than ever, could make a difference. And although she didn't seek the limelight, she understood that her greatest victory wasn't having destroyed the network that tried to erase her, but having become a woman impossible to silence. Over time, news about her case began to fade from the headlines, and that was a relief Dakota didn't know she needed. The absence of external cameras and microphones allowed her to fully focus on her son and the new projects she had begun. One of them was a book club for community mothers, a space where, over books and coffee, they could fearlessly discuss what was troubling them. Unintentionally, this circle also became a place of support for women who had experienced abuse or manipulation, even if they didn't always share it out loud. Dakota listened more than she spoke, but when she did, her words were charged with a calm authority, a product of everything she had overcome. Still, there was one day that reminded her that the past never truly disappears. Returning from shopping, she found an envelope in her mailbox with no return address, similar to the one she had received years before. Inside, there was only a photograph of her and her son on the porch taken from the street. There was no written message, but the intent was clear. Dakota took a deep breath, called the police, and notified Laura. She didn't feel the panic of before, but rather a cold determination. She knew she now had the means, the connections, and the fortitude to respond. That night, she locked the door, hugged her son, and promised herself, once again, that no one would ever use fear as a weapon against her again. In the days following that incident, the police installed preventive surveillance on the street and assigned night patrols to ensure there were no intruders. Dakota, far from being paralyzed, resumed her routine with the same determination she had learned to cultivate in recent years. She returned to teaching her classes, organizing her reading club, and welcoming the friends she had made in the community into her home. She didn't hide what had happened, but she didn't magnify it either. She recounted it as an isolated incident, confident that the measures taken would be sufficient. Her son, although aware that something had happened, continued attending school and participating in sports, protected by the discretion of those who already knew his story. As the weeks passed without further incident, Dakota began to feel that this chapter was truly coming to an end. The shadow of the network that had tried to destroy her had dissolved amidst court convictions and strategic moves. Now, her life revolved around small but meaningful projects: a new comparative literature course at the library, the idea of writing a book about her experience, and the promise of taking her son on a trip along the coast this summer. Gazing at the horizon from her porch, she understood that her greatest triumph lay not in the legal victories or the headlines, but in having regained the freedom to plan for the future without fear. And that, she thought, was a form of peace no one could take away from her. With the arrival of summer, Dakota began to get to know her neighbors better. In the mornings, she greeted Clara, a white-haired woman with slow steps, who was always watering her hydrangeas and who, over time, became an unexpected confidant. Clara had lived in that coastal neighborhood her entire life and knew everyone by name, something that comforted Dakota, accustomed to the cold anonymity of her previous city. One afternoon, while they shared lemonade on the porch, Clara told her she'd heard about her story from a distant cousin who lived in the capital. There was no morbidity in her voice, only a sincere look of respect. "You've already been through a hurricane. The wind blows differently here," she said, and those words stayed with her. Little by little, Dakota began to let herself be drawn to the small rituals of the community. She attended the Saturday markets where she bought fresh fruit and homemade bread. She participated in neighborhood meetings where things as simple as repairing the pier or organizing the local fair were discussed. She discovered that, in that environment, time had a different rhythm. It didn't run, it unfolded patiently. Yet amid that calm, a pang of unease sometimes appeared when she saw a strange car pass by twice on the same street, or when she noticed someone watching her more than usual at the market. These weren't direct threats, but reminders that, although she was far removed from her past, she couldn't forget what she had learned. Surveillance could hide in the most innocent routine. One of those pangs of unease intensified one August afternoon as Dakota and her son were leaving the city library. As they walked toward her car, she noticed a man leaning against a lamppost, seemingly distracted by his phone. However, as soon as they passed, he looked up and followed her with an attention that couldn't be mistaken for coincidence. He didn't make any threatening gestures, but the discomfort was immediate. Dakota quickened her pace, helped her son into the vehicle, and drove off without looking back, although she felt a knot tightening in her stomach the entire time. That night, she reviewed the security camera footage at home, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Still, she jotted down the man's description and the license plate of a car parked nearby. The next day, she spoke to Clara about what had happened. The neighbor listened calmly and then gave her some advice that, though simple, proved comforting. Don't let a single incident rob her of the sense of home she was building. "Here, we all look out for each other. If you see him again, don't hesitate to tell me. You're not alone," she assured him. That genuine solidarity became a reminder that, although the past had taught her to live on guard, she could also rely on those around her. It was then that Dakota decided to become more involved in neighborhood life, agreeing to coordinate activities at the annual fair. She wanted her son to grow up knowing that, even after a storm, people could be trusted again. Preparations for the fair became a positive distraction. Dakota took it upon herself to organize a book exchange booth, an idea that so excited the neighbors that donations soon began pouring in. From classic novels with old dedications to recent editions still wrapped in cellophane, the constant interaction with people who shared her love of reading gave her back something she thought she'd lost: the ability to enjoy simple conversations without an undercurrent of tension. Her son also participated, helping to sort the books by genre and decorating brightly colored posters. The fair, once just a local event, became a personal goal for her. On opening day, the air was filled with the scent of roasted corn and sea salt. Dakota greeted each visitor with a genuine smile, until, amidst the bustle, she spotted a woman who looked strangely familiar. She wore dark glasses and a simple dress, but there was something about her posture and the way she turned her head that set off an inner alert. She couldn't place her immediately, but the sense of déjà vu was undeniable. The woman approached the booth, wordlessly browsed a couple of books, and after a few minutes, left without buying anything. Dakota watched her walk away through the crowd, certain that this wouldn't be the last time she'd see her. That night, unable to get the image of the woman out of her mind, Dakota reviewed old folders with photographs and press clippings related to her case. It was then that memory clicked. She had seen her at a hearing, sitting at the back of the room, discreetly taking notes. She wasn't part of the legal team or an accredited journalist. At the time, Dakota thought she was just a curious onlooker, but now she understood that her presence hadn't been a coincidence. The next day, she took the description and a partial screenshot from the fair's cameras to the police station. The officer who assisted her took careful notes, promising to check if there was any connection between the woman and the former suspects in the case. In the weeks that followed, Dakota didn't see the stranger again, but her memory crept in at the most unexpected moments. When she opened the window in the morning, when she crossed the street to her son's school, even when she closed the library door. She decided not to let the uncertainty isolate her. Instead, she reinforced her self-protection routines. She made a digital copy of all the documents related to the case, updated the camera system, and coordinated with Laura again to maintain an open channel with the authorities. She didn't want to live obsessed, but she wasn't going to let her guard down either. She had learned that calm wasn't the absence of danger, but the certainty of being prepared to face it. As autumn settled into the coastal city, Dakota began to notice how the community's slow pace helped her balance vigilance with everyday life. Crisp mornings were spent preparing for her lessons, and in the afternoons, she strolled along the beach with her son, collecting shells and stones, which they then stored in a jar on the mantelpiece. It was a simple ritual, but it served as a tangible reminder that some spaces remained safe. Yet, on these walks, small glimmers of caution also appeared. Quick glances toward the entrances to the sand, identifying new faces among the strollers. It was as if her mind had learned to superimpose two layers of reality, one of enjoyment and one of constant observation. On one of those walks, she came across a man walking a Labrador retriever. Upon seeing her, he greeted her with a good afternoon that was too familiar to be casual. Dakota returned the greeting out of courtesy, but something about his tone and the way he held his gaze left her feeling odd. Upon returning home, she mentioned it to Clara, who assured her that the man was new to the neighborhood and didn't usually participate in community activities. This fact, far from reassuring her, reinforced her instinct to remain vigilant. Without alarming her son, she decided to slightly change their walking routes and vary their timing, a practice that gave her back the sense of control she valued so much. As the weeks passed, the Labrador man stopped appearing on her walks, and Dakota decided to give him no more space in her mind. She focused on preparing a special activity at school to celebrate World Book Day, where she invited several local authors to read excerpts from their works. The response was so positive that the auditorium was filled with students, parents, and neighbors. During the event, as she watched her son in the front row, attentively following each reading, she felt a deep sense of pride. That image, her son laughing and clapping, became one of those memories one keeps as an emotional anchor for uncertain days. However, the next day brought a minor shock. When she arrived home from work, she found a brown envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a yellowed newspaper clipping about Megan Lang's arrest, accompanied by a handwritten note. Some people don't forget. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the police, upon examining it, could find no clear fingerprints. Dakota didn't feel the paralyzing fear she'd felt before, but she did feel a lingering unease. She decided to strengthen communication with her legal and police contacts again, aware that, even though she lived in a quieter place, her story still cast a shadow. That night, after her son fell asleep, Dakota sat at the dining room table with a new notebook. It wasn't to jot down tasks or reminders, but to begin something that had been on her mind for months, writing her own version of the story. She wanted to capture every detail, not to relive the pain, but to record what happened from her perspective, without distortions or outside interpretations. She filled the first page with a sentence that sounded more like a declaration than an introduction. Surviving isn't keeping quiet, it's telling stories so it doesn't happen again. Feeling in control of the narrative, even on paper, gave her an unexpected calm. Over time, this writing became a nightly habit. Some entries were raw and detailed moments of intense fear. Others, however, spoke of small daily victories, such as watching his son make new friends or enjoying a sunset without thinking about threats. He discovered that by writing, he was not only creating a personal record but also organizing his emotions, giving them a place and meaning. Laura, reading some excerpts, suggested he consider publishing it someday, not as a sensationalized testimony, but as a guide for others facing similar forms of harassment. The idea still seemed far-fetched, but for the first time, he didn't rule it out. With the arrival of winter, the house by the sea became a warm and quiet refuge. Dakota decorated the living room with soft lights and thick blankets, creating an environment where her son could do homework by the fireplace while she wrote. Her routine during those days included short walks along the shore, even in the cold wind, as a way of reminding herself that she was living in a place she had chosen for its tranquility. However, amidst this calm, an unexpected email broke the monotony. An anonymous sender sent her a link to a video that, when opened, showed a blurry recording of the front of her house. There were no explicit threats, but the implication was clear. Someone was still watching her. Instead of letting her anxiety get the better of her, Dakota forwarded the email to the police and shared it with Laura, who immediately requested a trace of the IP address. That same night, she installed an additional filter on her home network and updated all her passwords. She didn't like living in defensive mode, but she understood that prevention was part of her new normal. Later, while sipping tea on the screened-in porch, she reflected on how far she'd come since that first message she'd received at her mother-in-law's house. She'd learned to transform fear into strategy, and while she knew the surveillance could continue, she also knew that now she was the one with the tools and the strength to respond. The investigation into the anonymous email yielded results faster than Dakota expected. The IP address was linked to an internet cafe in a neighboring town, and the premise's security cameras showed a young man using one of the computers on the exact date and time of the email. Although a direct connection to the former suspects could not be confirmed, the police did not rule out the possibility that he had been hired to send the message. For Dakota, the discovery didn't bring relief, but rather a reassurance. Even far from her former surroundings, there were still people willing to try to intimidate her. The difference was that now those attempts were met with an active and documented defense system. Aware that she couldn't live solely reacting to provocations, Dakota began planning long-term goals. She enrolled in an online creative writing course, intending to polish her manuscript and give it a structure that could one day become a book. She also organized a short trip with her son to a nearby nature reserve, where they spent 3 days without phones or internet connection. Walking along paths surrounded by pine trees and listening to the sea from a cliff reminded them both that there was a much bigger world than the one they had inhabited amidst the conflict. That experience strengthened her conviction that her story should not be defined by fear, but by the ability to continue building, even after having lost almost everything. When they returned from the reservation, Dakota found a letter in her mailbox on the letterhead of an independent publisher. It wasn't a threat or an anonymous message. It was an invitation. Someone had read an excerpt of her manuscript, which Laura had unwittingly shared with a contact, and wanted to propose publishing her story. The envelope included a handwritten letter in which the editor explained that they saw her story not only as testimony, but also as a tool to raise awareness about illegal surveillance and emotional abuse. Dakota felt a mixture of surprise and vertigo. She wasn't sure she wanted to expose every detail, but the idea of transforming her experience into something that could help others began to take shape. She spent days reflecting on the proposal. She spoke with her son, explaining that if he accepted, her story would be known by many more people. The boy, with his characteristic direct sincerity, told her that he was proud of what his mother had done, and that maybe other mothers need to know how to be brave. That sentence was decisive. Dakota called the editor and arranged a meeting. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, that she would face criticism and relive painful moments, but she also understood that telling her story in her own words would be the ultimate victory over all those who tried to silence her. When they returned from the reservation, Dakota found a letter in her mailbox on the letterhead of an independent publisher. It wasn't a threat or an anonymous message. It was an invitation. Someone had read an excerpt of her manuscript, which Laura had unwittingly shared with a contact, and wanted to propose publishing her story. The envelope included a handwritten letter in which the editor explained that they saw her story not only as testimony, but also as a tool to raise awareness about illegal surveillance and emotional abuse. Dakota felt a mixture of surprise and vertigo. She wasn't sure she wanted to expose every detail, but the idea of transforming her experience into something that could help others began to take shape. She spent days reflecting on the proposal. She spoke with her son, explaining that if he accepted, her story would be known by many more people. The boy, with his characteristic direct sincerity, told her that he was proud of what his mother had done and that maybe other mothers need to know how to be brave. That sentence was decisive. Dakota called the editor and arranged a meeting. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, that she would face criticism and relive painful moments, but she also understood that telling her story in her own words would be the ultimate victory over all those who tried to silence her.